Good morning, Seahawks. This is Miss Campen, and this week's story time is a book called George Washington and the General's Dog. I chose this book. It's from our school library. I brought it home with me to read to my own son, who's in the first grade, because he really loves dogs. And so we read as many dog books as we can. And so I chose this book because it's about dogs, and he loved it so much that he thought I should share it with all of you. So today I'm going to read to you George Washington and the General's Dog. And if you can see the cover there, that's George Washington, who a lot of you have probably heard of before, and one of his favorite dogs. You can see in this picture of George Washington right here, the years under his picture that tell when he was alive. So George Washington lived from 1732 to 1799. George Washington is one of America's greatest heroes. Most people know that George was honest and brave, but there's something about George that people don't always know. What is that? It's that George loved animals. You can see that picture there. Can you see the turkey that's hugging George's leg? I thought that was silly. George learned to ride horses as a boy. Sometimes he rode into town. George rode fast, but he never fell. People said he was the best rider that they had ever seen. And back in the time when George Washington lived, a lot of people still rode horses to get where they needed to go. So riding horses was a skill you needed to have. When George grew up, he moved to a farm called Mount Vernon. Every day, George checked on the horses and hogs. He checked on the oxen, the mules, and the sheep, but he spent the most time with his dogs. You can see at the bottom of the picture there, he's playing with some dogs. George had a lot of dogs. He owned more than 36 dogs in his lifetime. He took them hunting. He played with them. He even gave them cute names like Mopey and Sweet Lips and True Love. And this is a picture of George going hunting in the woods with his dogs. Sometimes George spoiled his dogs. He let them run around the house. One day, George's wife Martha made a ham for dinner. George's dog Vulcan jumped up and stole the ham right off the table. Martha chased after him, but George just laughed. You can see there the dog stole the dinner right off the table, but George just thought it was funny. George liked being at Mount Vernon with Martha and the animals, but America needed him. America was not yet its own country. It was an English colony. That means it belonged to England. Many American colonists wanted to be free from England, so they went to war. The war was called the American Revolution. There's a picture of George and Martha, his wife, at home with his favorite dog, Sweet Love. The colonists chose George to be their general. And a general is who's in charge of the army during a war. George chose his favorite dog, Sweet Lips, to go with him. He said goodbye to Martha and Mount Vernon. He jumped on his horse, Nelson, and then he rode into battle. Sweet Lips was right beside him. And there's George going off to war. His horse was named Nelson, also a famous animal that belonged to George Washington. In George's day, soldiers often brought their dogs with them to war. Dogs helped hunt. They helped track the way. Dogs helped guard against wild animals. And best of all, dogs were just great partners. So dogs were very helpful to the soldiers during war. They fought off wild animals like bears and wolves. They protected the soldiers. They were friends to the soldiers. They helped the soldiers hunt meat to eat while they were fighting. So the dogs were very helpful. The general of the English army was named William Howe. He had a dog too. He also had 9,000 soldiers, and they had plenty of supplies. So this is the army from England who we were fighting against. And you see how their uniforms all had red coats? Those soldiers were often called redcoats because of their uniform. And this was the English army. Their general was William Howe. In the American army, our general was George Washington. George did not have nearly as many supplies. Sometimes his soldiers were cold, sometimes they were hungry, but they did not give up. For a while, they didn't think they were going to be able to win the war. They were so cold and hungry, they didn't have enough clothes, enough shoes, enough food for all of their soldiers, but they kept fighting. In the fall of 1777, George's troops went to Pennsylvania. They were fighting the English troops. Guns fired, rat-a-tat-tat. Cannons roared, boom, bang. Smoke filled the air. You can see the two armies fighting here. Finally, the fighting ended. The English soldiers went back to their camp. The battle was over for the day. The smoke began to clear, and George noticed a dog without a collar. It looked lost. George bent down and patted the dog's head. You can see the English soldiers going home. And there's George. The dog followed George back to the colonist camp. He wagged his tail. "Whose dog is this?" wondered George. George looked at the dog's collar, and the tag had a man's name on it. And that name was William Howe. William Howe? George couldn't believe his eyes. William Howe was the enemy. This dog belongs to General William Howe, George Washington's enemy. What do you think George is going to do with the dog of his enemy? Word about the enemy dog spread through camp. Some of George's men wanted to keep the dog, but George said no. George believed the dog belonged with his master. George had his friend, Alexander Hamilton, write a note or a letter to James Howe. The note said that George wanted to return the dog. So you can see there George's friend Alexander Hamilton is writing a letter to General Howe telling him, "We have your dog." Both sides raised white flags. The white flags meant no one could fight. George's soldiers walked the dog across the battlefield. They gave him back to General Howe. So on that side you can see the American soldiers bringing the dog back, and then on the other page you can see how happy General Howe is to have his beloved dog back. People in England found out about George's good deed. The English still wanted to beat George and win the war, but now they respected him. Some English people even liked him. They had never heard a story of such great kindness between enemies. So there are the people that live in England, the country we were fighting against, and even though they were fighting against George and they still wanted to beat him, they thought that was such a nice thing that he did to give General's dog back. In 1783, America won the war against England and became its very own country. George Washington went home to Mount Vernon. You can see in America there was great celebration because we had won the war. This summer when we celebrate the 4th of July, that is because of this, when we won the war and became our own country of America. Friends around the world wanted to honor George. They wondered what he would like. They even remembered the story about the dog. So soon, presents started arriving at Mount Vernon for George Washington. The King of Spain sent George a mule. George named him the Royal Gift. So the King of Spain sent George Washington a gift of a mule, because George loves all animals. A friend from France gave George an even bigger gift, more dogs. He gave him 7 dogs from France. George's work was not done, though. The American people needed a leader. Now that they're their own country, they need someone to run their country. They elected George to be their very first president. So George Washington was the very first president of the United States of America. People all over America loved their new president. They cheered him when he rode by in his carriage. They knew it was him because his 6 white horses always led the way. So George Washington always rode around in a carriage led by 6 white horses. And in the back of the book, this is a true story. It really happened, which means it's nonfiction. And so on the very back page here, it shows you a picture of George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, William Howe, and this letter at the bottom is an actual picture of the real letter that Alexander Hamilton wrote to General Howe, telling him, "We have your dog and we'd like to return him." And those are the pictures of the men, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and General Howe. And that is the end of our story for this week, George Washington and the General's Dog. If you liked this, I encourage you to also click on the link below this one, which will take you to a video reading of Tuesday Tucks Me In, which is the story of a military service dog, and also to go to Epic, where they have a wonderful book called Hero Military Dogs that also talk about dogs during war and how they help soldiers. Thanks, and we'll see you guys next week.